It is 1954. Two scientists, James Olds and Peter Menner, were performing an experiment on mice. This experiment would revolutionize our understanding on the brain. The idea of the experiment was to place some electrode inside the brain. Once we activate those electrodes or trigger those electrodes, it will activate some area in the brain. So they were expecting to study arousal, but they stumbled on something else, something way and much more powerful. It's the brain reward system. What happened is the mouse was so happy when the electrode was activated, and when they gave him the power to activate it in himself or itself, it went crazy. It was pushing the lever to activate it 700 to 1000 times up until he collapsed from fatigue. He chooses that over everything, forsaking water, food, sleep, everything. He was ready to do anything. He was not ready to do anything but simulate that one area of the brain. Even they went further. They put an electric grid between him and between the liver. He was happily ready to go electrocute and shock himself to get to that liver and finally push it again. Sounds like addiction, right? In this series, we will talk about addiction. So this incredible discovery of the reward system opened the door to explore first how our brain is wired to pleasure, reward, and motivation, and also how this system will be hijacked by a drug or a substance, and it will be a slave of it, and in what we call addiction. So let's explore it together and dive deeper inside the brain and understand first how's the reward system, what's the reward system, and how is it working. First and foremost, drugs that we are going to talk about is psychoactive drugs. So psychoactive drugs causes addiction, unlike other drugs of heroin, cocaine can cause addiction because they have psychoactive effects. Like mood change, change in perception, in cognition, unlike other medicine or other drugs like antibiotic and anti-acid. So every addiction starts by a use where there is a hit of a very high level of joy or pleasure, and then it goes to the abuse where the addict keeps using even though he knows that it's affecting all of his life and he sees he can know all the bad effect, but he keeps using it, and this is what we call abuse. After that, it will be the craving. He will just see everything will remind him of that substance. He will keep craving it. He wants it everywhere, all the time, just to feel normal. And then the withdrawal starts, and whenever he's not using, he will experience withdrawal symptoms that can go from leisure to white up until fatal, like in the cases of alcohol addiction. So all this is because one substance has hijacked that reward system, and let's understand how the reward system works and how it will be hijacked. So the brain reward system is a very complex structure. It's a network of connection in the heart of the brain, specifically in the mesolimbic pathway. It's often called the pleasure pathway. So areas in the brain are connected to each other, and some areas have specific roles together. That's why we call it the pleasure highway. It connects three stations. Station 1 is the VTA, or the ventral tegmental area, moving to the nucleus accumbens, and finally by the prefrontal cortex. These areas together produce the feeling of pleasure, and by that they reinforces behavior that you usually need to survive and thrive, like eating, social bonding, and sex. But what happens when a substance like a drug artificially flood the brain with what we call a neurotransmitter that we call dopamine? So that dopamine is responsible for this pleasure response, or it's called the feel-good neurotransmitter, and we will see that later. So the brain communicates by those neurons. Those neurons communicate with each other. They are not like tightly connected. There is gaps in between that we call synapses. So once a message reaches the end of a neuron or a nerve cell, it will release some chemicals. Once they bind to the other receptor, then the message will be transmitted. It's on these synapses, on this area, that all the magic happens. Here in this area is where our neurotransmitter dopamine, or the feel-good pleasure, activate. So this synapses allows dopamine, which is the feel-good neurotransmitter to bind to receptor in the receiving neuron or the postsynaptic neuron. This will create a neural signal that strengthens connection between the behavior and the pleasurable outcome. So every time this is happening, every time you feel this pleasurable, your brain will reinforce the memory and will reinforce the connection of this pathway, which will make it easily and memorable thing to do. So we can say it will become a habit. So we will be seeking this behavior again and again. Also, when dopamine levels spikes at that level, when we flood our system with dopamine or flood the synapses with dopamine, the brain learns to prioritize drug over any other behavior or natural rewards. So over time, the brain will adapt at this very high level of addiction of the substance use, making it very hard to feel any pleasure from anything else, like eating, socializing, watching the TV, or anything else. This is how addiction will rewire the brain and make it a slave of that substance. So as the drugs continues, the brain, or the drug use continues, the brain will become desensitized to dopamine. So this dopamine will no longer or give the addict the same level of spike or that high that he reaches at the first time. So this means it will take more of the drug to reach that same level of high. At the same time, natural resources like of pleasure always are getting on the second and the third degree of pleasure, so they are less effective at releasing dopamine. So this is why addicted people, they report feeling of being depressed or being numb if they are not using the drug, because nothing else can give them pleasure or joy except the drug. So the brain will stop everything because he learns that I want this. How did I get this level of dopamine pleasure? This must be something I need to learn or I need to get in order to thrive and survive. But unfortunately, that high will no longer be achievable, because every time we use or every time the addict use, the pleasure response gets lower and lower until one time he only needs to use the drug to feel normal. And then he will start craving, he will start seeing the drug everywhere, making association. He sees friends, he hears music, he sees an empty, he sees a bar, he says he's alone in his bedroom, he's sad, he has any challenges. All those become cues learned by dopamine, which reinforces learning, and all those cues will cause craving. So the dopamine will spike just to push you to get that substance, even though you're not feeling happy or you're not feeling pleasure anymore. So how the dopamine is acting exactly, that will be in the rest of the series, so don't forget to follow us.